They told us tariffs would bring jobs back, that punishing Canada, our neighbor, our #1 trading partner, with a 35% tariff increase would make America stronger. That by slapping duties on their tomatoes, their aluminum, their lumber, we'd ignite a new era of domestic revival. That was the promise. And now, here we are. Store shelves lined with overpriced produce. Farmers bulldozing crops they can't afford to harvest. Coca-Cola executives debating whether to abandon aluminum cans for plastic bottles because tariffs have made packaging unaffordable. Welcome to the new American economy, an economy built not on strategy, but on slogans, built not on trust, but on tantrums. This morning, a new 21% spike on tomato imports took effect, and what began as a headline about trade is now a full-blown economic rupture. In Texas and Florida, tons of tomatoes sit rotting in warehouses, not because of bad weather, not because of blight, but because no one is buying. The price of a box won't even cover the labor to pick it. Chad Smith, a farmer in Florida, said it flatly. We can't keep going like this. His family's been farming for 3 generations, and now they're considering walking away, not because the soil went bad, but because the economics. And while this crisis unfolds in slow motion across American fields, something else is happening quietly, deliberately, just north of the border. In Canadian greenhouses, under glowing LEDs and climate-controlled perfection, tomatoes are thriving. They're not just feeding Toronto, they're feeding Tokyo, Dubai, London. These aren't new markets. These are the very markets American farmers used to dominate. Used to. You want to know why that shift happened? It wasn't because Canada outshouted us. It's because they outmaneuvered us. While Trump stood at rallies promising to make America great again with tariff hikes and Twitter posts, Mark Carney, the only man to ever run 2 G7 central banks, was locking down trade deals, building agricultural resilience, and preparing Canada to take what America would foolishly abandon. In the same week, Trump doubled aluminum tariffs to 50%. Canada signed a $12 billion export agreement with Asian markets. They didn't gloat. They didn't posture. They just made the deal and moved on. Meanwhile, Walmart warned investors that prices across their stores were rising, not because of inflation, not because of supply chain shocks, but because of Trump's trade war. You see, this isn't a story about Canada versus the United States. This is a story about competence versus chaos, about strategy versus ego, about what happens when a government governs and what happens when a government performs. Let's talk about aluminum. 44% of American aluminum comes from Canada. That's not a trade imbalance, that's an industrial reality. The U.S. can't make enough aluminum on its own, not anymore. Not since smelters shut down years ago due to high costs, outdated technology, and lack of investment. Reopening them now would take years and billions, and even then they'd fall short of national need. So what does Trump do? He slaps a tariff on Canadian aluminum. The result? Prices rise. American manufacturers scream. Coca-Cola considers abandoning metal cans, and Canada keeps selling aluminum anyway now at inflated prices. That's not punishment. That's a gift. Trump tried to start a trade war, and Carney turned it into a monopoly. And while American producers are stuck with rising costs and confused supply chains, Canada is writing contracts, big ones. In 90 days since Trump escalated tariffs, Canada secured $47 billion in new trade agreements. Japan signed long-term energy deals. South Korea inked partnerships for Canadian nickel, a critical metal in EV batteries. The EU finalized a critical minerals pact that deliberately bypassed U.S. suppliers. Let me say that again. Bypassed deliberately. Why? Because the United States, in the eyes of our allies, is no longer stable enough to trust. That trust vacuum, that's the real story here. Because international trade isn't just about price, it's about reliability. When Mark Carney gets on the phone and tells a buyer in Seoul that Canada will deliver, they believe him. When Donald Trump threatens tariffs unless his terms are met, phones go silent. While Washington burns bridges, Ottawa builds them. This isn't a victory lap, it's a hostile takeover. Quiet, calculated, and complete. Every policy Trump deploys to make America great again turns into a strategic win for Canada. Every tariff, every threat, every disrupted supply chain, it's a message to the world that doing business with the U.S. is a gamble. And nobody likes to gamble with billion-dollar contracts. Let's go back to the grocery store. You're shopping for tomatoes. They're 40% more expensive than last year. That's not because of climate change. That's not because of scarcity. That's because the U.S. government decided to disrupt a perfectly functional supply chain, jacked up the cost of imports, and didn't bother to invest in a domestic alternative. So we're not getting jobs, we're not getting self-sufficiency, we're just getting higher prices and humiliation. Because when you tell the world we're going it alone, they'll believe you and they'll start going around you. That's exactly what they're doing. Countries are redirecting supply chains to Canadian ports. Multinationals are locking in long-term agreements with Canadian producers. The markets the U.S. once considered guaranteed are being handed away, one spreadsheet at a time. This is how decline looks. It's not loud, it's not apocalyptic, it's bureaucratic, it's logistical, it's death by policy memo. One missed deal, one broken alliance, one canceled shipment. And before you know it, the global economy has been rewired without you. And standing at the center of it all, calmly, methodically, is Mark Carney. The most dangerous man Trump never saw coming. The genius of Mark Carney's strategy isn't just that it capitalizes on Trump's chaos, it's that it does so without making a sound. While Trump weaponizes the American megaphone, Carney uses silence. No campaign rallies, no slogans, no red hats, just contracts, just certainty. And in the world of global trade, certainty is everything. This is a man who guided Canada through the 2008 financial crisis without a single bank collapse, then flew to London and helped the UK navigate Brexit without panic in the bond markets. And now he's back, not with a title, not with bluster, but with leverage, real leverage, the kind you don't need to tweet about, the kind you use behind closed doors with trade ministers, central bankers, and CEOs who move billions with a handshake, because that's what this has become, a trust game. And trust in Washington has collapsed. In Tokyo, South Korea, Berlin, the talk is no longer about how to work with America, but how to work around it. That shift is monumental. It used to be that every major trade deal began or ended with the United States at the center. But as Trump raises tariffs, tears up agreements, and uses access to American markets as a threat rather than an invitation, global partners are hedging, and Canada is where they're placing their bets. The $12 billion trade deal with Asia, that wasn't just about market access. That was about reputational assurance. Asia needs a North American partner. It used to be the U.S., now it's Canada. Japan's billion-dollar commitment to Canadian nickel for electric vehicle batteries is not just about minerals, it's about future-proofing supply chains in a world where America can no longer be counted on. It's about building alliances in an era of volatility. And Canada, under Carney's quiet leadership, offers something Washington can't: predictability. And let's not mistake what's happening here. This is not Canada stumbling into a moment. This is a surgical, intentional, systemic redrawing of the global economic map. Carney saw what Trump would do before Trump even did it. That's what makes him dangerous. He didn't wait for the fallout. He built Canada's Plan B, C, and D, and while American pundits were still mocking Canada as a junior partner, he was on a plane to Seoul, then Tokyo, then Brussels, mapping out a world where America no longer sits at the center of gravity, and the proof is in the pipeline. Literally, Canadian exports of critical minerals are being rerouted to Europe. Ports in Vancouver are humming with traffic, once destined for Long Beach. Asian demand is shifting north. Even Mexico, once so deeply tied to American supply chains, is beginning to pivot. Their automakers are sourcing Canadian aluminum. Their exporters are drafting alternate routes through Ottawa. These are not symbolic gestures. These are structural shifts. Shifts that outlast presidents, policies, and election cycles. And it's not just metals and tomatoes. It's not just about what you can touch. It's also about narrative, about reputation. And in the reputational economy, Canada is climbing while America is free falling. Let's talk about that for a moment, because there's something profoundly humiliating happening to America right now, and nobody in power seems to want to acknowledge it. For 3/4 of a century, the United States sold itself as the safe bet, the bedrock, the anchor of the global economy. The country where contracts meant something, where the rules didn't change depending on the mood of the president. That era is over. Tariff after tariff, executive order after executive order. Threats, sanctions, ultimatums, all of it has left the world with one clear impression: the United States cannot be relied upon. It is no longer a stable partner, it is a volatile actor. And in global commerce, volatility is death. So countries are responding rationally. The EU signs a $12 billion deal with Canada in a single week. Japan shifts sourcing of strategic material. South Korea moves EV battery infrastructure north. These aren't snubs, they're exits. Graceful, quiet, permanent exits from the American orbit. Meanwhile, back in the U.S., the economy looks strong on paper, but brittle at the core. Walmart is openly warning investors. Doug McMillon, the CEO, said, tariffs are pushing prices up, week to week. That's code. That's his way of saying this isn't sustainable. And he's right. Families are walking into grocery stores where prices for basic items, tomatoes, cereal, soda, are climbing for reasons that have nothing to do with supply chains or droughts. They're climbing because of policy. Because we've turned our economy into a political weapon, and in doing so, we've shot ourselves in the foot. You want to see the real world impact? Look no further than the soda aisle. Coca-Cola is seriously considering abandoning aluminum cans, an American icon, because tariffs have made packaging too expensive. That's what Trump's policy has done. It's taken a symbol of Americana and turned it into a liability All while environmental groups watch in horror, realizing that the push away from plastic is being reversed because the trade war made it impossible to go green. And again, Canada isn't scrambling. Canada is cashing in, because 44% of America's aluminum still comes from Canadian suppliers. The difference is now we pay more for it. That's not leverage. That's lunacy. It's the equivalent of taxing yourself and pretending it's a victory. So when Trump stands at the podium and declares we're bringing in trillions of dollars, what he's really doing is taxing Americans to pay for his fantasy. Tariffs are not paid by the exporting country. They're paid by the importer, by us, by consumers, by families. And while we celebrate the illusion of economic nationalism, the rest of the world is building something different, something more stable, something more modern. Let's return to tomatoes for a second, not just because they're symbolic, but because they illustrate the future of agriculture. American farms are struggling with outdated irrigation, climate volatility, labor shortages, and unpredictable policy. Meanwhile, Canadian farms, especially greenhouse mega farms, are thriving. These are not fields in the traditional sense. They're industrial marvels, controlled environments, powered by renewable energy, precision engineered crop systems, nutrient optimization guided by AI. Tomatoes that arrive in Tokyo with the same texture, color, and shelf life as when they left Toronto. Japanese grocery executives call them flawless. Same quality, same packaging, same delivery time, every time. That's the future. And while America wastes time fighting yesterday's battles, Canada is building tomorrow's industries. It's no longer about size. It's about smartness. It's about consistency. It's about building a reputation that you keep and then leveraging it when others falter. That's what Carney has done. He saw the fragility of American exceptionalism, and he didn't challenge it head on. He sidestepped it quietly, strategically, and now he's replacing it deal by deal, port by port, pallet by pallet. Every tomato that ships out of Vancouver instead of California is a data point. Every aluminum contract renewed at inflated prices is a confirmation. Every European buyer that signs with a Canadian firm is a line crossed off the American ledger. This isn't a trade dispute anymore. It's a reckoning. And the United States, once the most trusted brand in global economics, is now being rebranded by its own behavior. And here's the part that should terrify Washington. This shift isn't temporary. These aren't stopgap deals. These are 10-year contracts, multi-decade supply chain realignments, institutional decisions to pivot away from the United States, not just for now, but indefinitely. When Japan signs $4 billion in long-term nickel deals with Canada, that's not a pause on America. That's an exit. When the European Union accelerates a $12 billion trade agreement with Ottawa, that's not a hedge, that's a divorce. Because trust once broken doesn't reset with the next election. These companies, these governments, these industries, they aren't betting that America will suddenly become stable in 4 years. They're building a new system that doesn't include us at all. A new web of relationships, ports, currencies, and contracts that bypass Washington and make it irrelevant. And who benefits? The country that was never supposed to lead. The one we always looked at as our junior partner. The one we joked about, Canada. But the Canada of 2025 is not the Canada of cliches. This is a country run by professionals, by diplomats and economists who don't perform for applause, who don't weaponize policy for populist gain. They execute quietly, effectively, decisively. They don't need to threaten, they just deliver. And that delivery is reshaping the global economy. Let's talk again about the mechanics, because the transformation isn't abstract. It's physical. It's measurable. Shipments that once landed in Seattle now dock in Vancouver. Cargo that once crossed the border into Detroit now reroutes through Quebec. Energy contracts that once ran through Houston are being signed in Calgary. Supply chains, those invisible lifelines of modern commerce, are detaching from the United States like muscle from bone. And the world isn't flinching, because the world has been preparing for this. You think Carney was the only one reading Trump's trade threats like a playbook? Tokyo read them too. So did Brussels. So did Seoul and Mumbai and Berlin. Everyone saw the writing on the wall that America's commitment to rules-based trade was disintegrating, that every agreement was now conditional, every deal vulnerable to the next social media outburst. And while we were busy staging tariff showdowns, the rest of the world got busy staging alternatives. Mark Carney didn't need to do much, just be ready. Because when the United States slammed the door on its own partners, Canada didn't have to break in. The world knocked and Ottawa opened it. What we're witnessing is not just a story about tomatoes and tariffs. It's the story of empire in reverse. America is teaching the world how to live without it, and the world is learning fast. What began with aluminum and tomatoes has spread. Canola oil, softwood lumber, electric vehicle batteries, critical minerals, and now green technology. In sector after sector, U.S. instability is creating global vacancies, and Canada is filling them. Look at Mexico. For decades, it was the linchpin of America's North American manufacturing hub. Now, Mexican companies are quietly building relationships with Canadian partners, not to sever ties with the U.S., but to diversify against it. That's the tell. That's how you know trust has broken. Not when allies walk away, but when they start planning their escape route. And that escape is being paved with Canadian consistency. Contracts honored, prices stabilized, borders open, diplomacy boring, which is to say, effective. Let's not forget what this does domestically, because this isn't just about lost exports or missed trade opportunities. This hits home hard. In the Rust Belt, where aluminum workers once dreamed of resurgence, plants remain shuttered. In farm country, where tomatoes rot in warehouses, generational family farms are being liquidated. In cities, where groceries get more expensive week after week, consumers are being gaslit into believing it's all someone else's fault. But the receipts are clear. This was a choice, a self-inflicted economic wound wrapped in the language of nationalism. And now we're bleeding jobs, bleeding credibility, bleeding power, while watching our neighbor grow stronger in the silence. Mark Carney understood that in a global economy, the vacuum left by an erratic superpower is the rarest kind of opportunity, one you can walk into without firing a shot. No confrontation, no conflict, just competence. That's the story here. That competence, executed quietly over months and years, has outmatched the spectacle of American politics. And that spectacle is now being priced in bond markets, in bilateral agreements, in the very future of Western trade architecture. When future historians look back at this period, they won't talk about the tweet storms or the televised rallies. They'll look at the contracts, the rerouted ships, the farm closures, the shift in trust, and they'll say, This is when it changed. This is when the world looked at America and said, we're done. But it didn't end with a bang. It ended with a tomato, with a soda can too expensive to make, with a nickel contract signed in Ottawa, not Washington, with a world that no longer feels the need to ask America's permission. That's the future we're now living in. And it wasn't forced upon us. We chose it.